There was a boy named Arjun, who lived in a small town near the mountains, and he had never left that place in all his 17 years of life. And every single day looked the same to him, like a photograph that someone had copied 1,000 times, and he was tired of it. His mother worked at a cloth shop in the market, and his father had gone away when Arjun was only 5 years old, and nobody ever talked about where his father went or why he left. And Arjun had learned very early that some questions were not welcome in his house, and so he stopped asking. The town was called Bearpur, and it had one main road and a few side streets, and a railway station that was so old that the paint had peeled off the walls, and the benches were broken, and the clock on the platform had stopped working years ago, and nobody had ever bothered to fix it, because the trains only came twice a day anyway. Arjun went to school every morning, and came back every afternoon, and helped his mother at shop, and then sat on the roof of his house at night, and looked at the stars and wondered what the world looked like beyond the mountains. And he imagined cities with tall buildings and bright lights, and people who were always in a hurry, and he wanted to be one of those people so badly that it made his chest hurt. His best friend was a girl named Priya, who lived 3 houses down from him, and she was the only person in the whole town who understood how he felt, because she also wanted to leave, and she also dreamed of a bigger life, and they would sit together on the roof and talk about all the places they would go someday. One evening in the month of June, when the air was warm and thick, and the insects were buzzing around the single streetlight near Arjun's house, Priya came running to him with a piece of paper in her hand, and she was breathing hard, and her eyes were wide, and she said that she had found something important. She held up the paper, and it was a notice from a school in the city of Delhi, and it said that they were offering 10 scholarships to students from small towns, and the scholarship would pay for everything, including the hostel and the books and the food, and all a student had to do was pass an entrance exam that was going to be held in 6 weeks. Arjun took the paper and read it again and again, and his hands were shaking, and he felt something light and warm spreading through his body like sunlight breaking through clouds. And he looked at Priya, and she was smiling, and he knew that this was the chance he had been waiting for his entire life. But there was a problem, and the problem was that the exam was going to be held in the city of Lucknow, which was 300 kilometers away, and Arjun had never traveled anywhere, and he did not have the money for a train ticket, and he knew that his mother could not afford it because she barely had enough to pay for their food and the rent. He did not sleep that night. Thin mattress, and stared at the ceiling, and listened to the fan making its slow creaking sound, and he thought about what he should do, and he made a decision that he would find a way no matter what, because this was his one chance, and he was not going to let it go. The next morning he went to the railway station and asked the man at the ticket counter how much a ticket to Lucknow would cost, and the man looked at him with bored eyes and told him the price, and it was more money than Arjun had ever held in his hands at one time. He walked back home slowly and sat in the small kitchen, and his mother was making tea, and she looked at him and asked what was wrong, and he did not want to tell her because he did not want her to feel bad about not having money. But she kept asking, and finally he showed her the paper. She read it slowly because she had not gone to school for very long, and her reading was not fast. And when she finished, she put the paper down and looked at Arjun. There were tears in her eyes, and she said that she was proud of him for wanting something more than this town could give him. But then she told him what he already knew, which was that they did not have the money, and she said she was sorry, and her voice broke a little when she said it. And Arjun felt a pain in his heart that was worse than any pain he had ever felt, because he could see how much it hurt her to say those words. He told her not to worry, and he said he would figure something out. And he went outside and walked to the edge of the town, where there was a big old banyan tree, and he sat under it and thought. Priya found him there an hour later, and she sat down next to him and did not say anything for a while, and then she said that she had an idea. and her idea was that Arjun could work for the next few weeks and save up the money for the ticket, and she said she would help him find work. And so they made a plan, and the plan was simple, and it was that Arjun would do any job he could find in the town, and Priya would study the subjects that were going to be on the exam and make notes for him so that he could study at night after working all day. The very next day, Arjun went to the market and asked every shopkeeper if they needed help, and most of them said no, but the man who owned the tea stall said he could use someone to wash cups and serve customers, and he would pay Arjun a small amount each day. It was not much, but it was a start, and Arjun worked at the tea stall from early morning until the afternoon, and then he went to the grain shop and helped carry heavy sacks, and then he went to the barber and swept the floor and collected the hair and cleaned the mirrors. By the end of each day, his body was aching, and his hands were sore, and his feet were tired. But he would go home and wash his face and eat whatever his mother had made, and then he would climb up to the roof, where Priya would be waiting with her notes, and they would study together under the light of a small lamp. The weeks passed slowly, and the pile of coins in the tin box under Arjun's bed grew slowly, and he counted them every night before sleeping, and every night the total was a little more than the night before, but he was not sure if it would be enough. And the date of the exam was getting closer and closer, and then something happened that changed everything. And it happened on a Tuesday evening when Arjun was walking home from the grain shop, and he saw an old man sitting by the side of the road, and the old man looked lost and confused, and Arjun stopped and asked if he was okay. The old man looked up at him with pale gray eyes, and said that he had come to Birpur to visit his sister, but he could not remember where she lived, and he had been sitting there for hours, and nobody had stopped to help him. And Arjun felt something twist in his stomach, because he knew what it felt like to be ignored. He helped the old man stand up, his sister's name, and the old man told him, and Arjun knew exactly who she was, because it was Mrs. Sharma, who lived near the temple. And so he walked the old man all the way to her house, and Mrs. Sharma cried when she saw her brother, and she thanked Arjun many times. Arjun smiled and said it was nothing, and he turned to leave, but the old man caught his arm, and looked at him with those gray eyes, and said something that Arjun would never forget. And he said that kindness was the rarest thing in the world, and that the universe always pays back those who are kind. Arjun walked home, thinking about those words, and not knowing that the old man was about to change his life in ways he could not even imagine. 2 days after Arjun helped the old man, he was at the tea stall washing cups, when Mrs. Sharma came walking up to him, and she had an envelope in her hand, and she was smiling in a way that made her wrinkled face look almost young again. She held out the envelope, and told Arjun that her brother had asked her to give it to him. And Arjun wiped his hands on his shirt, and took the envelope, and opened it, and inside there was money, and it was more money than he needed for the train ticket to Lucknow. And there was also a small note, written in shaky handwriting. The note said that the old man's name was Mr. Verma, and he was a retired teacher who had spent 40 years teaching children in a government school in the city, and he had seen something special in Arjun's eyes, and he wanted to help him because he believed that good people deserve good things. Arjun stood there in the middle of the tea stall, holding the money and the note, and he could not speak, and his eyes were burning, and the tea stall owner was looking at him with a confused expression. And Mrs. Sharma patted him on the shoulder and told him to use the money well. He ran all the way to Priya's house and showed her the money and the note, and she screamed so loud that her mother came running out, thinking something terrible had happened. And when Priya explained what had happened, her mother smiled and said that God works in mysterious ways. That night, Arjun showed his mother the money, and she held the note and read it 3 times, and then she pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes and whispered a prayer for Mr. Verma. And Arjun knew that she was grateful in a way that words could never express. Now he had the money for the ticket, but he still had a problem, and the problem was the exam itself. Because the exam was going to test subjects that Arjun had studied in school, but at a much higher level. And the students from the city schools had better teachers and better books and better everything. And Arjun was scared that he would not be good enough. But Priya was a very smart girl, and she had been working hard on the notes, and she had organized everything into sections, and she had written practice questions, and she had even gone to the town library, which was just a small room with old books, and found some useful material. Every night they studied, and Arjun discovered something surprising about himself, which was that he was actually very good at mathematics, and he could solve problems quickly, and he could see patterns in numbers that other people could not see. And Priya told him that this was his gift, and that he should trust it. The days went by, and Arjun kept working at the tea stall and the grain shop during the day, and studying at night, and he was sleeping only 4 or 5 hours, and his mother was worried about him, and she would leave a glass of warm milk on his table when he was studying, and sometimes she would sit quietly in the corner and watch him, and there was a look on her face that was a mixture of pride and fear. She was proud because her son was working so hard, and she was afraid because she knew that if he succeeded, he would leave her and go to the city, and she would be alone. And she did not want to be selfish, but she could not help the feeling of dread that sat heavy in her chest like a stone. Arjun could sense his mother's fear, and it made him feel guilty, and one night he put down his books and went to her, and sat beside her and held her hand, and told her that no matter where he went, or what he became, she would always be the most important person in his life. And she smiled, but her eyes were wet. 3 weeks before the exam, something unexpected happened, and it was that the monsoon came early, and the rain was heavy, and the river near the town swelled, and the bridge that connected Bairpur to the main highway was flooded, and nobody could get in or out of the town. The rain did not stop for 5 days, and the streets turned into rivers of muddy water, and the market was closed, and the tea stall was closed, and Arjun could not work. But he used the time to study, and he studied from morning until night, and Priya came over every day, splashing through the water with her notes wrapped in a plastic bag to keep them dry. On the 6th day the rain slowed down, and the water began to go back, but the bridge was damaged, and the local government said it would take at least 2 weeks to repair it. And this was a disaster, because the exam was in 3 weeks, and Arjun needed to get to Lucknow. He went to the railway station and asked if the trains were still running, and the station master, who was a thin man with a thick mustache and tired eyes, told him that the trains had been cancelled because of the flooding on the tracks, and he did not know when they would start again. Arjun felt the ground shifting under his feet, and he felt like everything he had worked for was slipping away, like water through his fingers, and he walked home in a daze, and sat on the roof, and stared at the gray sky and the rain-soaked town, and he felt a darkness inside him that he had never felt before. Priya came and sat with him, and she did not say anything encouraging, because she was honest, and she knew that the situation was bad, and sometimes silence is better than empty words. And they sat together and listened to the sound of water dripping from the roof. But Arjun was not the kind of person who gave up easily, and after sitting in that darkness for a while, he stood up and said that he was going to find another way to get to Lucknow, and he was going to take that exam even if he had to walk the entire 300 kilometers. The next morning, he went around the town asking if anyone knew of another route out of Bairpur, and most people shook their heads. But then he talked to an old farmer named Bola Singh, who lived at the edge of the town. And Bola Singh told him about a mountain path that went over the hills and connected to a road on the other side, where there was another town called Ramgarh, and from Ramgarh there was a bus service to Lucknow. The path was difficult, and it took a full day of walking to reach Ramgarh, and it went through dense forest and steep hills, and there were wild animals in the forest, and most people avoided it. But it was a way out, and that was all that mattered to Arjun. He told Priya about the path, and she immediately said that she was going with him. And he said no because it was dangerous, and she said that she did not care, and that he was not going alone. And they argued about it for a long time, and in the end Priya won, because she always won their arguments. They decided that they would leave 1 week before the exam, so that Arjun would have a few days in Lucknow to rest and prepare before the test, and they would carry food and water and Priya's notes, and they would walk through the mountains together. Arjun's mother was terrified when she heard the plan, and she begged him not to go. And she said that there would be other opportunities, and other exams, and other scholarships. But Arjun looked at her and said something that surprised both of them, and he said that his father had left without ever trying to make things better, and he was not going to be like his father. The room went very quiet after he said that, and his mother stared at him, and then she nodded slowly, and she went to her room and came back with a small bag, and inside the bag was a compass that had belonged to Arjun's grandfather, and she said that it would help him find his way. He took the compass and held it in his palm and felt its weight, and it was warm from his mother's hand, and he made a silent promise to himself that he would come back to her, and he would come back as someone she could be even more proud of. The night before they were supposed to leave, Arjun packed his bag and put in the compass and the money and Priya's notes and some food that his mother had prepared and a bottle of water and a torch and a small knife that Bola Singh had given him. And he looked at the bag sitting on the floor of his small room, and he felt a strange mixture of excitement and terror. He did not sleep that night either, and he lay on his mattress and listened to the sounds of the town and the distant rumble of thunder and the barking of a dog somewhere far away. And he thought about Mr. Verma and his kind gray eyes and the words he had said about the universe paying back those who are kind. And he wondered if the universe was testing him now to see how much he really wanted this. They left before sunrise, when the sky was still dark and the air smelled like wet earth, and the whole town was asleep. And Arjun's mother stood at the door and watched them go, and she did not cry, because she had already cried all her tears the night before, when Arjun was not looking. Priya was wearing her toughest shoes, and she had her own small bag on her back, and she looked brave, but Arjun could see a tiny tremor in her hands, and he knew she was scared, and he was scared too, but they walked forward anyway, because courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move in spite of it. Bola Singh had drawn them a rough map on a piece of paper, and the path started at the edge of the town where the last house ended, and the forest began, and the forest was thick and green, and the trees were so tall that they blocked out most of the light, even though the sun was now beginning to rise. They walked in silence for the first hour, and the only sounds were their footsteps on the muddy path, and the birds singing in the trees above, and the occasional snap of a branch, and Arjun kept checking the compass to make sure they were heading in the right direction. The path climbed upward, and it was steep, and soon both of them were breathing hard, and their legs were aching, and sweat was running down their faces, even though the air was cool, and Priya suggested they rest for a few minutes, and they sat on a flat rock and drank some water. From the rock they could see Bearpur below them, looking tiny and fragile, like a collection of toy houses. And Arjun looked at it and felt a strange sadness, because even though he wanted to leave, he also loved that little town, and it was the only home he had ever known. They continued walking, and by midday they had reached a part of the forest that was darker and denser, and the trees here were older, and their trunks were covered in moss, and the ground was soft and spongy, and there were strange sounds coming from deep in the woods, and Priya moved closer to Arjun without saying anything. They stopped for lunch and ate the rotis and pickle that Arjun's mother had packed, and they ate quickly, because neither of them wanted to stay in that dark part of the forest for too long. And then they picked up their bags and kept walking. In the afternoon the path split into two, and Bola Singh's map was not clear about which way to go, and Arjun looked at the map and then at the compass, and then at the two paths, and one went left and down into a valley, and the other went right and up the side of a steep hill. Priya said they should go left, because it looked easier, but Arjun felt something pulling him to the right, and he could not explain it, but it was like a voice inside him telling him to go up, and after thinking about it, he decided to trust his instinct, and they took the right path. The right path was hard, and the hill was steep, and at some points they had to use their hands to pull themselves up, and Priya slipped once and scraped her knee, and it was bleeding, but she wiped the blood away and kept going and did not complain, and Arjun admired her for that. Near the top of the hill, they came out of the trees, and suddenly the whole world opened up before them, and they could see for miles and miles, and there were green valleys and blue mountains, and a river shining like silver in the distance, and the sky was vast and endless. And both of them stood there with their mouths open and said nothing, because there were no words for what they were seeing. It was the most beautiful thing Arjun had ever seen, and in that moment, all his tiredness and fear melted away, and he felt something expanding inside his chest, and it was hope, and it was wonder, and it was the feeling that the world was enormous and full of possibilities. They stood there for a long time, and then they continued walking, and the path on the other side of the hill went downward, and it was easier and faster. They made good progress, and by the time the sun started going down, they had covered most of the distance to Ramgarh according to Bola Singh's map. But then the light began to fade, and the forest grew dark again, and they needed to find a place to stop for the night. And they found a small clearing near a stream, and they gathered some dry leaves and made a place to sit, and Arjun built a small fire using the matches he had brought. The fire crackled and sent orange sparks up into the dark sky, and they sat close to it, and ate more of the food and drank water from the stream after boiling it over the fire. And Priya took out her notes, and they studied by the light of the flames. It was strange to be studying mathematics in the middle of a forest, with the sounds of insects and animals all around them, and the stars visible through the gaps in the trees above. But Arjun found that he could concentrate better here than he ever could at home, because there were no distractions. No noise from the town, and his mind was sharp and clear. Priya quizzed him on algebra and geometry and trigonometry, and he answered most of the questions correctly. And when he got one wrong, she explained it patiently, and he understood it immediately. And she shook her head and said that it was unfair how quickly he could learn things. They talked for a while after studying, and Priya told Arjun something that she had never told him before, and it was that she was not going to apply for the scholarship herself, because she had decided to stay in Bairpur and take care of her mother, who was not well. And Arjun was shocked, and he said that she was just as smart as him, and she deserved the scholarship too. But Priya smiled, and said that life was not just about what you deserve, but also about what you choose, and she had chosen to be with her mother, and she was at peace with that choice. And she said that she was putting all her dreams into Arjun now, and he had to succeed for both of them. Arjun felt the weight of her words settle on his shoulders, and it was heavy. But it was also a kind of fuel that made him more determined than ever, and he promised her that he would not let her down. They slept in shifts, with one of them staying awake to keep the fire going and to watch for animals. And Arjun took the first shift, and he sat with his back against a tree and listened to the sounds of the forest and watched the fire and thought about everything that had led him to this moment. He thought about his mother alone in the house, and he thought about Mr. Verma and his kind eyes, and he thought about Priya sleeping a few feet away with her notes clutched to her chest, and he thought about his father, who had walked away from everything without looking back, and he wondered if his father had also once sat somewhere in the dark and thought about the future, and if he had also been scared, and if the difference between them was not in the fear, but in the choice to stay or to go. When it was Priya's turn to keep watch, Arjun lay down on the leaves and closed his eyes. And he dreamed that he was on a train. And the train was moving very fast through a landscape of green fields and blue rivers. And the wind was blowing through the open window, and he could feel it on his face, warm and fast, and full of the smell of faraway places. He woke up to the sound of birds, and the first gray light of dawn was filtering through the trees, and Priya was already awake, and she had boiled some water and made tea using the small packet of tea leaves she had brought. And they drank the tea and ate the last of the rotis, and then they packed their bags and started walking again. By mid-morning, they could see smoke rising in the distance, and they knew it was coming from Ramgarh. And they walked faster, and the path became wider and less wild, and soon they could see houses and fields and people working. And they looked at each other and grinned, because they had made it through the mountains. They reached Ramgarh by noon, and it was bigger than Bairpur, but still a small town. And they found the bus station, which was just a patch of dirt with a wooden sign and a bench. And they asked when the next bus to Lucknow was leaving. And the man at the counter said there was one leaving in 2 hours. Arjun bought 2 tickets, and they sat on the bench and waited. And Priya leaned her head against the wall and closed her eyes. And Arjun watched the people of Ramgarh going about their day. And he realized that every small town was the same in some ways and different in others, and that every person walking by had their own story and their own dreams. The bus came, and it was old and noisy and crowded, and they squeezed into a seat near the back, and the bus started moving. And Arjun watched through the dusty window as Ramgarh and the mountains slowly disappeared behind them, and the road opened up into a wide flat plain, and the world became bigger. Bigger with every passing minute. OL, pause. The bus ride to Lucknow took 8 hours, and the road was bumpy and full of potholes, and the bus stopped at every small town along the way to pick up more passengers, until it was so full that people were standing in the aisle and holding on to the overhead rails, and the air inside was hot and thick with the smell of sweat and diesel. Arjun sat by the window, and Priya sat next to him, and she fell asleep with her head on his shoulder, and he could feel her breathing slow and steady, and he was glad she could sleep, because she deserved the rest after everything she had done for him. He could not sleep, and he watched the world passing by outside the window, and he saw things he had never seen before, like highways with 4 lanes, and trucks so big they looked like moving buildings, and factories with tall chimneys pouring smoke into the sky, and billboard advertisements for things he had never heard of. As the bus got closer to Lucknow, the towns became more frequent and closer together, and then the towns merged into one continuous stretch of buildings and shops and traffic and noise. And this was the outskirts of the city, and Arjun pressed his face against the glass and stared at everything with wide eyes. He had seen pictures of cities in books and on the small television in the tea stall, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of it. And the scale of everything was overwhelming. And the buildings were so tall, and the roads were so wide, and there were so many people everywhere, moving in all directions like ants on a giant anthill. The bus pulled into the main bus station at 9 in the evening, and the station was huge and brightly lit and full of people and noise. And Arjun woke Priya up, and they grabbed their bags and stepped off the bus, and stood there in the middle of the station, feeling small and lost. They had no idea where to go, and they did not know anyone in Lucknow, and Arjun had a limited amount of money, and they needed to find a cheap place to stay for the next few days until the exam. And Priya looked around with a nervous expression, and Arjun took a deep breath and said they would figure it out. He went to the information counter and asked the woman there if she knew of any cheap places to stay. And she looked at them with a mixture of pity and suspicion, because they looked like what they were, which was 2 young people from a small town who were completely out of their depth. But the woman was kind enough to tell them about a dharamshala, which is a kind of free guest house attached to a temple, and it was about 2 kilometers from the bus station, and she wrote the address on a piece of paper and gave them directions. They walked to the Dharamshala through streets that were still busy, even though it was late at night, and the shops were lit up with bright lights, and there were people selling food on the sidewalks, and the smell of fried snacks and spices filled the air, honking and weaving through the traffic. The Dharamshala was a simple building with a courtyard, and they met the caretaker, who was an old man with a white beard, and he asked them why they had come to Lucknow. And when Arjun told him about the scholarship exam, the old man smiled and said that education was the greatest treasure in the world. And he gave them 2 separate small rooms and told them they could stay as long as they needed. The rooms were tiny and had nothing but a thin mattress on the floor and a fan on the ceiling and a small window, but they were clean and safe, and that was all that mattered. And Arjun thanked the old man and went to his room and lay down on the mattress and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the city outside. And he felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement bubbling inside him. The exam was in 3 days, and Arjun spent every waking moment studying, and Priya helped him review everything, and she drilled him on the difficult topics, and she made him do practice problems over and over until he could solve them without thinking. And she was a tough teacher, and she did not accept any excuses. On the 2nd day in Lucknow, Arjun decided to go and see the exam center, so that he would know exactly where it was and how to get there. And he did not want any surprises on the day of the exam. So he and Priya took a bus to the school, where the exam was going to be held. The school was a large modern building with a big iron gate and a green lawn, and it was the nicest school Arjun had ever seen. And there were other students there also checking out the location, and they were well dressed and confident, and they carried expensive bags and talked to each other in English, and Arjun felt a cold wave of doubt wash over him. He looked at those students, and he saw everything he was not, and they had grown up with good schools and private tutors and computers and books, and they had never had to wash cups at a tea stall or carry grain sacks to earn money for a train ticket, and he wondered if he was fooling himself by thinking he could compete with them. Priya saw the look on his face, and she knew exactly what he was thinking, and she grabbed his arm and pulled him aside, and she told him to listen to her carefully, and she said that those students might have had every advantage in the world, but they did not have what he had. She said that he had something that could not be taught in any school or bought with any money, and it was hunger, and it was the deep, burning need to change his life, and the willingness to walk through mountains and sleep in forests and work until his hands were raw, just for a chance. And she said that kind of hunger was more powerful than any textbook. Arjun listened to her, and he felt the doubt slowly dissolving and being replaced by something harder and stronger and more determined. And he nodded, and they went back to the Dharamshala, and he studied for the rest of the day with a focus that surprised even himself. The night before the exam he could not eat, and his stomach was tight, and his mind was racing, and Priya told him to stop studying, because he had done all he could, and now he needed to rest, and she said that trying to cram more information into his brain at this point would only make things worse. So they went for a walk in the streets near the Dharamshala, and the night air was cool, and the city was quieter than during the day, and they walked past closed shops and sleeping dogs, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with the exam, just to keep his mind relaxed. Priya told him about a dream she had, where she was flying over the mountains near Bairpur, and she could see the whole world spread out below her, and it was beautiful and peaceful. And Arjun told her about his dream on the train, and they laughed, and for a little while they were just 2 friends walking through a city at night, and the exam, scholarship, and the future all felt far away. When they got back to the Dharamshala, Arjun went to his room and lay down and tried to sleep. But his heart was beating fast, and his thoughts would not slow down, and he kept going over formulas and theorems in his head. And then he made himself stop, and he took out his grandfather's compass, and held it in his hand, and felt its weight and its warmth. He thought about all the people who were behind him, and his mother, who was sitting alone in their house in Bairpur, waiting for news, and Mr. Verma, who had believed in a stranger, and Priya, who had given up her own chance so she could help him, and Bola Singh, who had shown them the mountain path, and the woman at the bus station, who had told them about the Dharamshala, and the caretaker, who had given them rooms. He realized that he was not alone, and that he had never been alone, and that every step of his journey had been made possible by the kindness of other people. Him a strange and powerful sense of calm, and he closed his eyes and finally slept. He woke up early the next morning, and the sun was just coming up, and the city was starting to move, and he washed his face with cold water, and put on his cleanest shirt, and combed his hair, and looked at himself in the small cracked mirror on the wall, and he said to himself that he was ready. Priya was waiting for him in the courtyard, and she had bought tea and biscuits from a stall outside, and they sat together and had breakfast, and she looked at him and said that she believed in him, and that was all she said, and it was enough. He walked to the exam center, and the streets were busy with morning traffic, and he carried nothing but a pen and his admit card and the compass in his pocket. And he walked through the iron gate of the school and joined the line of students waiting to go inside, and his heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. The exam room was a large hall with rows of wooden desks and bright white lights on the ceiling, and there were about 200 students sitting in the hall, and the room was completely silent, except for the ticking of a clock on the wall, and the sound of papers being placed face down on every desk. A woman with glasses and a serious face stood at the front of the room and explained the rules, and she said they had 3 hours to complete the exam, and there were 5 sections, including mathematics and science and English and logical reasoning and general knowledge, and she said that they should begin. Arjun turned over his paper and looked at the first page, and for a moment his mind went completely blank, and the words and numbers swam in front of his eyes, and he felt a wave of panic rising in his chest, and he gripped his pen tightly and closed his eyes and took a deep breath. And then he heard Priya's voice in his head, saying that he had something those other students did not have, and he felt the compass in his pocket pressing against his leg, and he opened his eyes and looked at the paper again, and this time the words were clear and the numbers made sense. He started with the mathematics section because it was his strongest subject, and the first few problems were easy, and he solved them quickly, and his confidence grew with each one. And then the problems got harder and more complex, but Arjun found that he could see the patterns and the connections between numbers, and he worked through them methodically and carefully. The science section was more difficult, and there were questions about physics and chemistry and biology, and Arjun answered the ones he knew, and made his best guesses on the ones he was not sure about. And he did not waste time on any single question, because Priya had taught him that time management was just as important as knowledge. The English section was the hardest for Arjun, because English was not a language he had mastered, used much in his daily life in Bairpur, and the reading comprehension passages were long, and the vocabulary was advanced, but he read carefully and slowly, and used the context of the sentences to figure out the meanings of words he did not know. The logical reasoning section was interesting, and it was full of puzzles and patterns and sequences, and Arjun found that his mind worked well with these kinds of problems, and he solved them with a speed that surprised him, and he finished that section with time to spare. The general knowledge section was a mix of everything, including history and geography and current events, and Arjun answered what he could and left blank the questions about things he had never heard of, and he tried not to think about how many he might be getting wrong. When the woman at the front said that time was up, Arjun put down his pen and looked at his paper, and he had answered most of the questions, and he felt that he had done well in mathematics and logical. reasoning, and okay in science and general knowledge, and not great in English. But he had given it everything he had, and there was nothing more he could do. He walked out of the exam hall, and the sunlight was bright, and the other students were standing in groups, talking about the exam, and comparing answers, and some of them looked happy, and some looked worried. And Arjun walked past all of them, and found Priya waiting outside the gate, under a tree. She looked at his face, and tried to read his expression, and he kept his face neutral for a few seconds, and then he smiled, and said that he thought he had done okay. And she jumped up, and hugged him, and said she knew it. And then she asked him about specific questions, and they went through the exam together, as they walked back to the Dharamshala. That evening, they packed their bags, and went to the bus station, and bought tickets back to Ramgarh. And the journey home was going to be the same long bus ride, and then the walk through the mountains. But Arjun did not mind, because the hardest part was over, and now all he had to do was wait. The results would be announced in 2 weeks, and those 2 weeks were the longest of Arjun's life. And he went back to working at the tea stall and the grain shop, and every day felt like a year. And he tried not to think about the exam, but it was impossible, because it was the only thing on his mind. Priya told him to be patient, and his mother told him that whatever happened, they were proud of him. And the tea stall owner said that Arjun was the hardest working boy he had ever known. And even Bola Singh came by one day and asked about the exam, and nodded approvingly when Arjun told him about the journey through the mountains. On the 14th day after the exam, Arjun was at the grain shop lifting sacks, when Priya came running down the street, and she was screaming his name, and she had a paper in her hand, and she was crying and laughing at the same time. And Arjun dropped the sack he was carrying, and his heart stopped beating for a moment. She reached him and shoved the paper into his hands, and it was a printout from the internet, because Priya had gone to the one computer shop in town that had an internet connection, and she had checked the results, and there on the paper was a list of 10 names, and the 7th name on the list was Arjun Kumar from Berpur. He stared at the paper and read his name again and again, and the letters blurred because his eyes were filling with tears, and Priya was hugging him, and the grain shop owner was clapping, and people on the street were stopping to see what the commotion was about, and someone asked what happened, and someone else said that the boy from the cloth shop had won a scholarship to study in Delhi. The news spread through Berpur like fire, and within an hour the whole town knew, and people came to Arjun's house to congratulate him and his mother stood at the door, greeting everyone with tears streaming down her face, and a smile so wide it looked like it might break her face in two. Mrs. Sharma came and said that she would tell her brother, Mr. Verma, and she was sure he would be very happy. And the tea stall owner came and said that Arjun's tea was always free from now on. And even some of the shopkeepers who had turned him away when he was looking for work came and shook his hand and said they always knew he would do great things. That night, after everyone had gone home, Arjun sat on the roof with Priya, and they looked at the stars, and neither of them spoke for a long time. And then Priya said that she was going to miss him, and her voice was quiet and small. And Arjun said that he was going to miss her too, and that nothing would ever change between them, no matter how far apart they were. He told her that half of this scholarship belonged to her, because without her notes, and her teaching, and her encouragement, and her stubbornness in coming with him through the mountains, he would never have made it. And she shook her head, and said that all she did was help him see what was already inside him. A week later, Arjun stood at the old railway station in Berpur, and the clock on the platform was still broken, and the benches were still cracked, and the paint was still peeling. But this time, there was a train coming, and it was the train that would take him to Delhi and his new life. His mother was there, and she was trying very hard not to cry, and she handed him a bag of food she had packed, and she straightened his collar, even though it was already straight, and she told him to eat properly and study hard and not forget where he came from. Priya was there, and she gave him a notebook, and inside she had written all the important things he needed to remember, not for school, but for life, and things like always be kind and never forget the people who helped you. And when you feel lost, look at the stars, because they are the same stars that shine. Over, Burper. Bola Singh was there, and he gave Arjun a firm handshake and said that the mountains had tested him and he had passed. And Mrs. Sharma was there, and she said that Mr. Verma sent his love, and even the tea stall owner was there, and he handed Arjun a small thermos of hot tea for the journey. The train came, and it was the most beautiful thing Arjun had ever seen. And it was not beautiful because of how it looked, because it was actually an old and dirty train with faded paint and dusty windows. But it was beautiful because of what it represented, which was a door to a new world. Arjun climbed aboard and found a seat by the window, and he put his bag on the rack above, and sat down and looked out the window, and his mother and Priya and Bola Singh and Mrs. Sharma and the tea stall owner were all standing on the platform waving, and the train started to move, and the platform began to slide away. He pressed his hand against the glass and watched them getting smaller and smaller, and then the train went around a bend, and they were gone, and Bearpore was gone, and the mountains were getting smaller behind him, and the world was opening up in front of him, wide and green and full of light. He put his hand in his pocket and felt the compass, and he took it out and held it, and the needle pointed north, and north was the direction of Delhi and his new life, and he thought about everything he was leaving behind, and everything that was waiting for him ahead. And as the train picked up speed, and the wind came through the window, warm and fast and full of the smell of faraway places, just like in his dream, Arjun closed his eyes and smiled, because he knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning, and that the boy from the small town with the broken clock at the railway station was about to become someone the whole world would know. The last train out of Bearpore carried a boy who had nothing but a compass and a dream and the kindness of strangers, the love of the people who believed in him, and that was more than enough. That was more than enough.